Well, welcome to another edition of our Sunday School class. Today we start the fall quarter, lesson number 1. Today's lesson is for September the 3rd, 2017, and it's taken from Genesis, the 8th chapter, 20 through 22, and then going down to the 9th chapter, verses 8 through 17. The title of today's lesson is The Rainbow. Now, to give you a little bit of background of what has occurred prior to our text, this is, if you'll remember back, there was Adam and Eve in the garden. They fell. They had 2 sons, the righteous son and a sinful son. The sinful son killed the righteous son. Then they had another son who was living godly. And then the human race had begun to multiply and spread out throughout the world. They begin to degenerate and begin to go into sin. And we see how that the godly line of Seth began to intermingle with the ungodly line. And there had been each successive generation had begun to fall away and to go into sin. Then God said, well, I'm going to have to deal with this. And so there was going to be this great flood. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And God told Noah to build this huge ark. Get all of 2 of everything that was, at least 2 of everything, and the kind of animals they could eat to take a little bit more with them. And so there was 8 people saved of the human race. The flood happened. Everybody else was killed off, and then the waters had subsided, and that's where we are at now at our point for today's lesson. And there's a lot of things that I could say to substantiate the great flood, the universal flood, how that virtually every ancient society has a discussion of this flood, which is exactly what you would expect. It's exactly what you would expect if there was a universal flood. Naturally, if there was a universal flood that had wiped out everybody except 8 people, and the earth was replenished from those 8 people, then you would expect every race of people, ancient race of people, to have a discussion of that universal flood, which is exactly what we see. There's also other things that we could talk about, but we're not going to spend very much time trying to make a defense for the belief in the universal flood. We have to note that first off, the Bible in the book of Genesis is very plain about the universal flood, and Jesus substantiated that universal flood, the story in the Old Testament, when he talked about how in the days of Noah. So there can be no doubt in our minds of the validity of that universal flood and the accuracy, the factual accuracy of Noah during that universal flood. But today we're going to be talking about the rainbow. Okay? Now, Genesis 8:20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, this is the first recorded instance of an altar in the Bible. The very first recorded instance of an altar in the Bible. Now, it's not the first recorded instance of anybody making an offering. We know that Adam and Eve's first two sons, Cain and Abel, we know that there was offerings made at that point, and we also know that that it can be made. It can be said that the offering was made when God made clothes and slaughtered animals to be making the clothes for Adam and Eve after they fell. But there is no mention of an altar until the time after the flood, when Noah and his family come out of the ark. And this is that instance. Okay, the 21st verse. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. So we see here where God looks down and has pity on the earth, and he says that man's heart, even though it is evil, that these animals and living creatures on the planet, that they are not partakers of man's evilness and such the like. So God's not going to send this universal flood again. Okay? 22nd verse. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So we see how that God's talking about how the seasons will continue to go on. Now, that is not to say that there are not been times of cooling and warming throughout the history after the Great Flood, because they certainly were. There are records even as recent as the time of the right before the Revolutionary War in the United States. There was some pretty brutal winters right before then. And I've even read of some folks talking about how that there was a mini ice age before during right before that time period, of how that there was this great cooling and the winters were a lot longer and they were a lot more harsher. And so certainly we know that to be the case, yet still there were still seasons, regardless whether or not the general cooling of the earth during that time period, they were still seasons. Now, if there is global warming, which I kind of believe there are, but regardless, but if there are global warming, then there still will be seasons. It's just that everything will be during that time of warming. everything would be generally a little bit hotter, but there'll still be seasons, because for seasons to actually stop occurring, the earth would pretty much will have to move on its axis, and it would have to actually shift and begin to be different in the way that it sets in space. So that's basically what God's saying here, is that He's going to leave the earth pretty much well on its axis, behaving the same way generally that it's been behaving all this time period of having summer and winter and day and night, and these things will go on and on. Okay? Now, going down to the 9th chapter, where it reads, "Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth." Now, our Jewish friends talk about how that this is the Gentile covenant. And that is a very true statement. It is. This is the universal covenant that God made with the human race and with the creatures of this planet, regardless of whether or not they were Jew or Gentile, or whether or not they were a saved Christian or not a Christian. This is the covenant that God made with the entire race at this point. This covenant of Noah. And it is a universal covenant to the entire planet. Okay? The 11th verse, "I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So we see where this promise of God that the earth will never again be covered by, universally covered by water as it was during this great flood. And it is a promise of God to the entire planet. Okay? Now going down the 12th and 13th verse, "And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." Now, you can build, you can look at this in a lot of different ways. There are some good Bible scholars with good scientific background behind them who make a very convincing argument that there were no rainbows visible on the earth before the great flood. Now, the biblical reason for that you can interpret it to be that way is the fact that God made this big deal when he was talking with Noah about this sign of this covenant by having the rainbow in the sky. Okay? And it is very clear in the text when you read that, how that God makes a big deal out of that rainbow in the sky. Now, there's also a scientific reason why folks believe that there was not a rainbow visible before the great flood. And that is the fact that some scholars, some people with scientific backgrounds who believe in the great flood believe that the earth was surrounded by a canopy of ice, and that was one of the sources for the water for the great flood, and that it actually didn't really fully rain in the sense that we think of rain prior to the great flood. So if the earth was in this, underneath this shroud of ice, then the sunlight would have been highly filtered, and there would not be a rainbow, because direct sunlight would not be hitting the earth. And so after that ice canopy was broken up and it fell to earth and triggered one of the things that triggered the great flood, and then direct sunlight began to hit the earth, then that would give the possibility and the potential of rainbows being formed from that direct sunlight coming down to the earth. Now, there's also another interesting point, that if you are a very careful Bible reader, if you will notice that the ages of people prior to the flood were astronomically long. And that would be another indication and another case that you can build from biblical statements in the Bible of an ice canopy over the earth. Because if you filter out the ultraviolet radiation and it's not getting to the people of the earth, they would not be aging as quickly as we age now because of the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Now, I'm not going to 100% say that there has to be an ice canopy, had to have been an ice canopy, and that absolutely had to be the first time a rainbow was ever seen. I'm saying that it makes perfect sense to me. Their explanation makes perfect sense to me. And unless I see convincing evidence otherwise, I personally believe that there was a ice canopy around the earth, and that one of the ways that God triggered the great flood was the breaking up of that ice canopy, and that ice canopy fell to earth in the form of this great deluge that fell on the antediluvian world, and that was one of the things that triggered the great flood. Because if you'll also notice how that the Bible does talk about how that it was a mist that watered the earth and not so much rain that watered the earth prior to the great flood. There's also another important thing that I want to bring out in today's lesson is this thing about a bow in the cloud. Because, as we all know, the original Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And it is an interesting fact that bow in English can be used for a rainbow, and it also can be used for an archer's bow. Well, it just so happens that that also holds true for Hebrew. This bow in the cloud, that word is the same word that is used for an archer's bow in other places in the Hebrew Old Testament. So there is a double meaning in using that word, bow in the cloud being this beautiful rainbow, that there is peace now between God and the earth, that he was hanging his bow up to have peace, the same way that a warrior would hang his bow up on the wall in a time of peace. So it's really cool the way that word is the same word in both places, and it carries over. A lot of times these things don't carry over to the original language, and the only thing that really matters is the way the original language was laid out. And it is the same way with bow in Hebrew as it is with English. Okay? Now, continuing on. 14 and 15. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now, certainly, as we have seen just recently down in Corpus Christi, certainly there are floods, there are tsunamis, there are catastrophic events that happen, hurricanes, and floods that do happen. But these are not universal floods. They only occur in certain areas. And that is what God has promised, is that he would never again wipe out the entire planet with a universal flood. Okay, 16 and 17. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Now, aren't you thankful and glad that God did make this covenant for all flesh that is on the earth? Well, friends, you tune in again next weekend for another edition of our International Sunday School lesson.